Alright, so in this video we're going to go over the incremental exercise test protocol that we performed for your first lab report. So it's an incremental exercise test because every 3 minutes we go up in power output, or the amount of work your subject is doing is going to increase every 3 minutes. Okay? What we really care about is at the end of these 3-minute stages, during the final minute, we measure heart rate, blood lactate, and steady state VO2. If you're not familiar with what steady state VO2 is, you have to remember, at the start of each of these stages, VO2 is going to change very rapidly, whereas near the end of the stage, it's going to plateau and not change very much. So when you go to make the figures for your lab report, make sure you are only graphing the VO2 data from the final minute of each stage, because that represents the VO2 needed to do the workload of that stage. So here's our subject cycling. They're breathing in on the right side through that red tube, the tube with the red arrow on it. They then breathe out into the blue tube. In the middle, the mouthpiece, it has 2 one-way valves. This makes it impossible for the subject to breathe out into the red tube or breathe in from the blue tube. So all air that they breathe in comes from the red tube, and all air that they breathe out goes down the blue tube. When they exhale, all of that air goes down the blue tube to the mixing chamber. Okay? So they breathe out. All of that air, known as VE, goes down this tube into the mixing chamber, the large transparent cylinder on your screen right now, and then it's forced out the other side through this turbine. And you can see the turbine sort of flickering in the gaps there. Okay? And so this turbine tells us how much air someone is breathing out. Okay? We then have what is called a sampling line. The sampling line will tell us the fractions of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the air that someone is breathing out. And we also have a probe that tells us the temperature and the humidity of the air that the subject is expiring. That blue disc there, that's essentially, you can think of that as their mask in order to keep the tester safe during COVID-19. All of the data is then put up on a computer screen for the researcher to see. And so every minute, we're also measuring blood lactate. Okay? So how you measure blood lactate is you just saw the researcher clean the finger with an alcohol swab and dry it. He then pokes it with a lancet. He will squeeze very gently until there's a small droplet of blood. He then wipes away that drop. He does it again for good measure. In this case, he's using a capillary tube, and he has to fill that entire capillary tube with blood. Once that tube is filled, he gives the subject a piece of gauze to hold on to so that they don't bleed all over the place, and he puts that capillary tube into a smaller test tube and shakes it up. Okay? This is an example here of the researcher collecting blood lactate while the subject is cycling. So he pokes, wipes away the first drop of blood, and fills his capillary tube. And then gives subject gauze. Okay, and here's one more angle of collecting blood lactate. Remember, we also need to record RPE at the end of each 3-minute stage, and that is as simple as putting an RPE scale in front and the subject points at their RPE. So once we get the blood lactate samples, we take it, we carry it across the room, in this case anyway, and we plop it into the blood lactate analyzer. Okay? The analyzer takes small little samples from each of these tubes, and then it will display for you what the subject's blood lactate and blood glucose levels were. So here we see the mouthpiece, or the valves in front of the mouthpiece in this case, being assembled. So there are two one-way valves. You can see the technician poking at the valves to show you that they only go one way. So this ensures that the subject inhales air from the room, and when they expire the air, it all goes into the metabolic cart. Air comes in, out. And then we simply screw on that adapter, and we can attach it to the mouthpiece. Attach the valves to the mouthpiece. Okay? There we go. So now when it comes to getting our subjects set up and ready to go, you get the bike set up so the subject's all nice and comfortable, height of the seat and such. Then the lab technician asks the subject to hold the mask against their face, and then they apply the remaining straps and adjust the straps to ensure a nice tight seal around the subject's face so that there's no air being inspired or expired that isn't going through those valves in front of the mouthpiece. So once the mouthpiece is on, you test to make sure that it is sealed. So you saw the subject put his hands on each side of the mouthpiece, and then he would blow out really hard. And so what that does essentially is, if he feels a lot of pressure when he blows out and he doesn't feel any air leaking around, usually it'll leak around if it's going to leak, the face mask will leak around your eyes or your nose, so it's really easy for the subject to feel. And then the lab technician will attach the hose. That hose is what leads to the metabolic cart. So at this time, the lab technician is simply explaining the test to the subject. Communication when you have a face mask on, as you can imagine, might be a little difficult, so the subject's communicating as if they are playing charades. And at this point, the test has now started. So once the test starts, usually your subject appreciates if you set up a nice fan. That way, once it gets real hard, the hardest part of the test is the workload itself and not how hot exercising in an exercise physiology lab can be. So note how the subject looks here. This is at the start of the test, so the first stage of the test. And in a few moments, we'll see how the subject appears to be feeling at the end of an exercise test, a max VO2 test. Here in real time is the collection of blood lactate and RPE. So this would happen ideally in the final minute to 45 seconds of each 3-minute stage of the incremental exercise test. The reason you collect this data at the end of the 3-minute stage is because it is then as representative as possible of the workload experienced by the participant in that 3-minute stage. It takes approximately 3 minutes to reach a steady state, depending on the fitness of the subject and the workload. So that's why we do it at the end of the 3-minute stage. So the subject there just pointed at a clipboard that had the RPE scale on it. So now we're jumping to later on in the test. And you can see this is what the data coming up in real time looks like on this metabolic cart. So periodically, the exercise physiologist administering the test will check that screen, make sure the numbers are looking right, make sure that the cart is measuring everything properly. And here we can see this is the final minute or so of the exercise test. Subject is working considerably harder, struggling considerably more than earlier on. And our exercise physiologist is grabbing one final lactate, grabbing one final RPE, and our subject is going to cycle until they are no longer able to continue. As soon as the subject stops, the exercise physiologist stops the metabolic cart from running. Also, the subject appreciates if the mask can be taken off as quickly as possible. So this is how subjects feel and look after a maximal exercise test.